This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Go to the link in the description below so they know that I sent you. Hello everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it is Wednesday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. In today's video, we're looking at Elementals. Elementals are one of the most frequently printed creatures in the game, with over 400 cards around that either are elemental creatures or produce elemental creature tokens. This number is about to increase too, with the release of Core Set 2020, where the Teamer colors have an elemental tribal theme. That inspired me to look at the best elementals in the game so far. In this video, we're going to look at the 10 elemental creatures, or cards that make elemental creature tokens, that have had the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A Pro Tour, Mythic Championship, or Legacy or Vintage Championship top 8 is worth 2 points, and a Grand Prix top 8 is worth 1 point. Now, let's get started with number 10. At number 10, we start with Master of Waves, a card that isn't an elemental at all, but it does bring some to the battlefield, and it is also an elemental lord. Sure, if your master dies, so do all of your elemental tokens, but the fact that it has protection from red does help it dodge a lot of the really efficient removal spells that are around. While it was in Standard, the master was the backbone of Devotion to Blue decks, coming down on turn 4 and making a bunch of elementals. It has also been played in modern Merfolk decks. It hasn't put up a top 8 in any format since 2017 though, so some of the new elementals in Core Set 2020 might have a shot at surpassing it. Wispmare is at number 9. Lorwyn is really the last time we saw elementals pushed as a tribal creature type, so you can bet that several Lorwyn elementals are on this list. Lots of elementals from Lorwyn have the evoke mechanic, and you can expect to see more of that as we continue with this list as well. Along with the evoke mechanic, these elementals tend to have abilities that trigger either when they enter the battlefield or leave the battlefield. The mechanic sort of makes these elementals into split cards. With Wispmare, you can either pay 1 white mana to blow up an enchantment, or 3 mana for a 1/3 flyer that blows up an enchantment. Both versions of the card have their place, depending on the board state or how desperately you need to destroy an enchantment. Either way you do it, you're getting a pretty good deal mana-wise. In both Block and Standard, it was a good way to blow up one of the more powerful cards around, Bitter Blossom. This led to it being featured in a wide variety of decks. It included more controlling decks, but also tribal decks like Kithkin. Wispmare was especially nice if you could use it early to blow up an enchantment while you evoke it, and then later play Revelark, who we will see later on this list, bring it back and blow up another enchantment. After going quiet for several years, Wispmare has more recently started seeing play in Vintage Dredge and Reanimator sideboards. These are decks that use their ever-growing graveyard as a toolbox, and they can reanimate the Wispmare when a problem enchantment is in their way. Wispmare has 6 points in Vintage in the last year, and it seems like it has a good shot at continuing to climb up this list. At number 8, we have CLOUDTHRESHER, another Lorwyn elemental with Evoke. Like Wispmare, it had 2 different options that are both reasonably efficient in the right situation. CLOUDTHRESHER has Flash, giving it some added flexibility. You either get a 6 mana 7/7 with Reach that does 2 damage to all the flyers and players, or a 4 mana version of the same effect, but you don't get to hold on to the Thresher itself, obviously. CLOUDTHRESHER saw a lot of play in both Block and Standard. This is because he absolutely thrashed what was the consensus best deck in both formats, Fairies. These decks were loaded up with small flyers, and CLOUDTHRESHER did a pretty great job of clearing the skies and then holding them down after the fact if you decided to cast him. He has never managed to see play since rotating out of Standard, but since it was a great silver bullet against Fairies, he saw plenty of play while he was there. At number 7 is Revelark, yet another elemental with Evoke, and one I mentioned earlier while talking about Wispmare. Revelark gives you some reasonable stats, offering a win condition in the air, but the real value of the card comes from what Revelark does when it leaves play. It brings back smaller creatures from the graveyard. That means you're dealing with a 5 mana 4/3 flyer who can kill you in the air, and you have to kill it somehow, but if you do, your opponent's going to get some value out of it. This is especially nice with other Evoke elementals because they tend to have abilities that get to trigger again if you bring them back with Revelark. In Standard, there was an eponymously named Revelark deck that focused on these strategies. Evoking a Muldrifter, for example, early, and then getting it back later with Revelark was a pretty nasty combination. Revelark saw a bit of play in both Block and Extended too, but Modern is where it put up the most points. It was great in Birthing Pod decks, since the deck tended to fill up the graveyard with creatures sacrificed to the pod, and eventually you could search up your Revelark to help you get those creatures back, especially if they were your combo pieces, which happen to have 2 or less power for the most part. So Revelark could single-handedly help you reassemble your combo. Unfortunately for Revelark, Birthing Pod got banned, and while it has gone on to see play in the toolboxy descendants of that deck, it hasn't proven to be nearly as dominant without Birthing Pod. At number 6 is Ingot Chewer, our 4th consecutive elemental with Convoke. Ingot Chewer is kind of a red version of Wispmare since it can destroy artifacts for only a single red mana. Unlike Wispmare though, it did not see a whole lot of play in Standard. This is because there weren't many problem artifacts in the format, and the Chewer also couldn't be brought back by Revelark. However, Ingot Chewer has gone on to be regularly played in formats that have artifact-centric decks in the metagame. In Modern, it is especially nice in Living In decks, which can evoke him early to blow up a problem artifact, and then get the Chewer back when Living In is cast, and in all likelihood, blow up another artifact, especially against opponents playing Affinity or Lantern Control. Vintage is actually the place where Ingot Chewer has been played the most, which makes sense. It's a format loaded up with powerful artifacts. It is used similarly to the way Wispmare is, in that you can fill up your graveyard and get the Ingot Chewer back when you need it to blow up a problem artifact. At number 5, we have Chandra Flamecaller, a planeswalker who can make elemental tokens. The Chandras in Core Set 2020 are interested in elementals, and that isn't the first time that's been the case. This Chandra was a very powerful planeswalker for more controlling decks because she had the ability to help you draw cards, she could wipe the board, and she could be used as a win condition thanks to those elemental tokens. So far, this Chandra has seen play exclusively in Standard, where she was played in a variety of control and ramp decks. It seems like she may be a bit too expensive to ever see play in non-rotating formats. At number 4, it's Voice of Resurgence, an elemental who also makes elemental creature tokens. Voice of Resurgence is a card that really punishes control players, since you get a creature token every time your opponent plays a spell during your turn, and this token is no joke. It has power and toughness equal to the number of creatures you have in play. It also makes this token when it dies, making it very hard for anyone to ever trade profitably with it. It has been a key card in aggressive decks since it was printed. In Block and Standard, it was played in Selesnya and Naya aggro decks primarily. It also sees play in Modern though. Initially, this was in Birthing Pod alongside Revelark. These days, it sees play in Collected Company as well as Hate Bear decks. At number 3, we have young Pyromancer, a creature who makes elemental tokens every time you cast an instant or sorcery spell. The Pyromancer is considered by some the best 2-drop in the game, and at the very least, it is in that conversation. Over the years, it has been played in decks in every format that are interested in playing a ton of instants and sorceries, because it allows you to play a control game, counter spells, burn your opponent's creatures, and still adding to your board with those elemental tokens, who can eventually just run your opponent over. It has been a running mate of Delver of Secrets in multiple formats, where the two form a powerful 1-2 punch of creatures who get better the more instants and sorceries you have. It has been found in Delver decks in Modern, Legacy, and Vintage. In Modern, it has also found some success in spell-heavy decks that no longer run Delver, and thus the Pyromancer actually gets to be in the name of these newer Mardu Pyromancer decks. Young Pyromancer is going to continue to put up points, and maybe it has an outside shot at catching the number 2 or number 1 card on this list in the future. At number 2, we have Shriekmaw, the last Evoke elemental on the list. Like the others, Shriekmaw is efficient whichever option you choose. It can be a sorcery speed terror should you decide to evoke it, and it can be a 5-mana 3/2 with Fear that kills a creature if you decide to hardcast it. Both are pretty nice options. Like all evoke creatures, Shriekmaw works really well along with reanimation effects, since you can play him early and kill something with the evoke, then reanimate him and kill something else. Only this time you get to keep the evasive creature around. It was played by all the black decks more or less in Block and Standard, with its most powerful home in Standard probably being the Makeshift Mannequin reanimation deck that liked to bring him back and get that trigger twice. In Modern, like some of its fellow evoke creatures, Shriekmaw used to see play in Birthing Pod decks as a nice card to search up when you really needed to kill something. It also sees play in Living In decks, who could easily kill 2 creatures with the Shriekmaw. It has been over a year since Shriekmaw last top-8'd an event, but it has come close several times in Modern Living In decks. And at number 1 is Fulminator Mage, an elemental who loves blowing up problem lands. While this elemental doesn't technically have evoke, he does sacrifice himself to do something, and as a result he is utilized in a similar fashion to evoke elementals that we've already looked at. It hardly saw any play in Block or Standard, where the ability to blow up lands wasn't all that useful. However, it has performed incredibly well in Modern, a format where non-basic lands are everywhere. Like Evoke Elementals, he has been played in Living End, where you can play the elemental early to blow up a non-basic land, then do it again when you cast Living End. He also sees a ton of play in Jund, and more recently in collected company decks, which can do sort of toolboxy things the way Birthing Pod used to, and sometimes you really need a Fulminator Mage to blow up a Tron land or something. Its most recent home has been in the sideboard of some Death Shadow decks. Fulminator Mage has a large lead in the number 1 spot, and it isn't going to be relinquishing its spot anytime soon. In fact, I think in a year's time, he'll probably be over 100 points. Well, those are the 10 best elementals in Magic's history. Do you think any of the new elementals in Core Set 2020 have a shot at making this list? If you do, let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe, and if you want to see more of the 180 plus episodes of this series, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.